It begins with a number that should stop a nation cold, except the nation cannot afford to stop, because stopping means standing still under a sky that is trying to kill it. 72.5 million people. That is the figure the National Weather Service quietly attached to its advisory maps this week, and it is not an abstraction. It is Miami reaching 100 degrees for only the second time in recorded history. It is Oklahoma City touching 109, a mark the city has crossed barely 20 times in its entire recorded past. It is Charleston, South Carolina, bracing for 21 consecutive hours, where the air itself will feel like it belongs in a furnace, somewhere between 103 and 124 degrees. And it is happening at the exact same moment that a wall of brown, choking dust more than a mile wide is rolling across the deserts of Arizona, swallowing highways, killing power lines, and reducing visibility to nothing in a matter of seconds. 2 disasters, 1 continent. And underneath both of them, a warning that scientists have been repeating for years, now arriving all at once, in real time, over the heads of the people who were told they had more time than this. The story does not start with the heat. It starts with the silence before it. The eerie stillness that meteorologists call a blocking pattern, the moment when the atmosphere simply stops moving. For days, a dome of high pressure has been sitting over the American Southwest like a lid clamped onto a pot that refuses to release its steam. Under that lid, air sinks, it compresses, it heats, and because it cannot rise, cannot escape, cannot mix with anything cooler, it just keeps building on itself, day after day, until whole cities are trapped beneath a ceiling of trapped, superheated air with nowhere to go. This is the mechanism behind what forecasters are calling a heat dome, and this week it did something rare. It stopped being a southwestern problem and began stretching its arms east, reaching all the way to the Atlantic coastline, dragging the misery of Arizona and Texas into the humid, saturated air of the southeast, where heat does not just sit on the skin, it soaks into it. That combination, furnace-dry heat colliding with swamp-thick humidity, is why the numbers on the ground feel almost fictional. A forecast high of 95 degrees in Charleston does not sound apocalyptic on paper. But factor in the humidity, and the human body experiences something closer to 108. Multiply that across 21 hours over 5 consecutive days, and you are no longer describing weather. You are describing an endurance test that the frail, the elderly, the outdoor laborer, and the unhoused are being forced to take without having agreed to it. The National Weather Service has a scale for exactly this kind of danger. A 4-level heat risk system built specifically because heat, unlike a hurricane or a tornado, kills quietly, without wind, without a visible funnel cloud, without a headline-grabbing wall of water. This week, a wide swath of the country stretching from the lower Mississippi Valley, across the Gulf states and into the Carolinas, sat locked at level 3 and level 4, the extreme tier, the tier reserved for conditions the agency itself describes as rare and prolonged enough to pose serious danger to anyone without reliable access to cooling. And that phrase, anyone without reliable access to cooling, is doing more work than it appears to. Because behind every heat map, behind every color-coded polygon stretching across a satellite image, there are real households making an impossible calculation. Do they run the air conditioning through the night and risk a power bill they cannot pay? Or do they crack a window and hope the humidity does not turn their home into a slow oven while they sleep? Emergency rooms across the affected states have quietly begun preparing for an uptick in heat exhaustion cases, the kind that creep up on people who believe they're simply tired, simply dehydrated, simply having an off day, until the confusion sets in, until the sweating stops, until what began as fatigue becomes a medical emergency that arrives without sirens. Heat, according to the government's own data, kills more Americans in an average year than any other form of extreme weather. Not hurricanes, not tornadoes, not floods. Heat. It does this precisely because it does not announce itself the way other disasters do. There is no evacuation order for a heat dome, no sandbags to fill, no shutters to nail down. There's only the slow, cumulative pressure of a body trying to cool itself in air that refuses to let it, night after night, with almost no relief even after the sun goes down. In Charleston and across much of the Gulf Coast this week, overnight low temperatures have been stalling in the upper 70s, numbers that sound almost pleasant until you understand that a body under heat stress needs nighttime cooling to recover, to reset, to survive the next day's onslaught. Without it, the damage compounds. Day 2 becomes more dangerous than day 1. Day 4 becomes more dangerous than day 3. This is not a single bad afternoon. This is a slow-motion siege, and this week marks its sharpest escalation yet. Consider what it means for a threshold like Miami's to fall only twice in the entire span of recorded weather history. Miami is not a city unfamiliar with heat. Its identity, its tourism economy, its entire relationship with the calendar year is built around long, humid summers that residents have learned to navigate for generations. And yet, even a place this practiced at enduring heat had never in 84 years of record keeping touched the triple-digit mark until this week, and even now has done so only once before. That is not a city having an unusually warm afternoon. That is a coastal metropolis colliding with a version of summer its own historical archive does not contain a template for. The same is true in a different register for Oklahoma City, where the National Weather Service's own data shows the 109-degree mark has been reached barely 24 times across the entirety of the city's recorded past. And it happened this week for the first time this late in the calendar, after the point in August when the region typically begins easing toward cooler air. These are not coincidences stacking up by chance. They are data points in the same widening pattern. Cities built around a certain expectation of what their worst days look like, now watching that expectation quietly rewritten in real time. Now widen the frame, because while the southeast bakes under a stagnant dome of trapped air more than 1,000 miles to the west, an entirely different kind of violence is erupting. Sudden, chaotic, and visually apocalyptic in a way that heat alone rarely is. In Arizona, the summer monsoon season has been feeding off the very same instability driving the heat wave. And this week, it detonated. Thunderstorms exploded across the Phoenix metro area with a speed that gave residents almost no warning. Within minutes, wind gusts recorded near Phoenix reached 66 miles per hour. Hurricane-strength winds arriving not from an ocean storm system, but from the violent downdraft of a collapsing thunderstorm cell slamming into the desert floor and spreading outward in every direction at once. That outward rushing wall of air did what it always does in the desert southwest. It picked up the ground itself and hurled it into the sky. What followed has become one of the defining images of this week's emergency, a towering wall of dust, some estimates placing it well over a mile across, rolling into the valley like a slow-motion tsunami made of earth instead of water. Visibility, which moments earlier had stretched for miles across the flat desert horizon, collapsed to less than a quarter mile in places, and in some pockets of northwestern Pima County, drivers reported losing sight of the road entirely. The National Weather Service issued dust storm warnings across multiple counties, the same urgent polygon-based alert format used for tornadoes and severe thunderstorms, because a dust storm of this magnitude is not a nuisance. It is a moving hazard capable of causing multi-vehicle pileups on desert highways where drivers, blinded in an instant, have nowhere to pull off and no way to see the vehicle stopping in front of them. The destruction did not stop at reduced visibility. As the storm tore through Maricopa and Pinal counties, it ripped into the power grid with the kind of indiscriminate force that leaves emergency crews scrambling before the wind has even fully died down. More than 15,000 customers lost electricity in the immediate aftermath, and that number climbed further as separate utility providers reported their own outages layering on top of each other. Nearly 17,000 customers dark in Maricopa County alone through one provider, another 1,000 through a second in Pinal County, and thousands more from a third utility across the broader metro area. In a normal week, a power outage is an inconvenience. In a week when the same region is also enduring extreme heat warnings extending through the weekend, a power outage becomes something far more dangerous. It is the removal of the one tool, air conditioning, that stands between vulnerable residents and a heat-related medical emergency. The storm that darkened Phoenix did not just knock out lights. It knocked out the last line of defense against the very heat wave, gripping the rest of the country. This is the part of the story meteorologists have started emphasizing with unusual bluntness. Heat and dust are not two unrelated disasters happening to share a news cycle. They are two expressions of the same underlying atmospheric imbalance, where little rain falls, or in the tense, charged moments just before a storm actually breaks, the same instability that would otherwise produce rainfall instead produces gusty, erratic winds capable of lofting enormous volumes of loose, drought-parched soil into the air. Meteorologists, tracking the pattern, noted plainly that the Phoenix area's dust storm arrived precisely on the churning edge of a thunderstorm complex, a signature collision of dry desert ground and sudden violent wind that the region has now witnessed repeatedly through the month, first in Imperial County and La Paz County along the California-Arizona border, in the middle of the month, where peak wind gusts approached 60 miles per hour, snapped or downed more than 150 power poles, and cut electricity to over 5,000 customers across the towns of Holtville, El Centro, Heber, and Calexico. Then again, less than a week later, in the heart of the Phoenix metro itself. To understand why the desert can produce a wall of dust more than a mile wide in a matter of minutes, it helps to picture what is actually happening inside a collapsing thunderstorm cell. As a storm matures, it draws in warm air and pushes it violently upward, building the towering anvil clouds visible for miles across the flat desert horizon. But eventually, that rising air can no longer sustain itself. Rain-cooled air, heavier and denser than its surroundings, comes crashing back down through the base of the storm in what meteorologists call a downburst, a churning column of wind that slams into the ground with tremendous force and then has nowhere to go but outward, spreading in every direction at once like water striking the bottom of a sink. In a place with vegetation and moist soil, that outflow simply pushes air and debris. In the parched, sun-baked desert floor of central Arizona, ground that has spent weeks being cooked by the same heat dome scorching the rest of the country, that outflow does not just push air. It lifts the ground itself, particle by particle, into a suspended wall of dust that can tower thousands of feet high and advance across an entire metro area faster than most drivers can react. Stand back far enough, and the pattern becomes almost mechanical in its cruelty. The same drought conditions that leave desert soil loose, cracked, and easily airborne are themselves a downstream consequence of the extended periods of extreme heat baking the region. The heat dries the land. The dried land, once struck by a thunderstorm's outflow winds, becomes ammunition for the next dust storm. And the dust storm itself, by grounding flights, snapping power infrastructure, and forcing highway closures, strips away exactly the kind of emergency capacity, working traffic signals, functioning air conditioning, clear evacuation routes, that a heat-stressed population needs most. It is a closed loop, one disaster manufacturing the conditions for the next. And this week, the American Southwest sat directly inside it. Meanwhile, the storm activity has not confined itself politely to the desert. Across the central and eastern United States, an active, moisture-laden weather pattern has been fueling rounds of severe thunderstorms and flash flooding that have disrupted travel corridors and outdoor plans across multiple states simultaneously. Meteorologists tracking the pattern have pointed to the same culprit driving the southeast's oppressive humidity. Steamy, saturated air sitting in place for days, acting as fuel for thunderstorm after thunderstorm rather than allowing the atmosphere to flush itself clean. It is the same atmospheric stagnation responsible for the extended heat risk, just wearing a different mask depending on which corner of the country it strikes. In the desert, that stagnant, unstable air produces walls of dust. In the Midwest and the East, it produces walls of rain, flash flooding, and the kind of sudden downpours that can overwhelm storm drains and turn city streets into shallow rivers within the span of a single afternoon. There is a reason emergency officials keep circling back to the same phrase this week: compound event. It is a term borrowed from climate science, describing exactly the scenario now unfolding coast to coast. Not one hazard, but several, striking simultaneously, each one amplifying the danger of the others rather than occurring in isolation. A heat wave alone is manageable if the power grid holds and cooling centers stay open. A dust storm alone is a frightening but survivable few minutes on the highway if the roads are otherwise clear. A round of severe thunderstorms alone is disruptive but rarely catastrophic. Layer them together. Heat, draining the grid's capacity at the exact moment storms are knocking out power lines. Dust storms blinding drivers on highways, already congested by people fleeing the heat toward whatever cooling infrastructure they can find. Flash floods, cutting off roads that residents might have used to reach a hospital or a shelter. And the danger compounds in ways that outpace the emergency response systems built to handle any single disaster on its own. This is precisely the scenario that has strained public infrastructure in cities across the affected zone this week. Cooling centers have opened their doors earlier and stayed open later than usual, absorbing residents who either lost power to the storms or simply cannot afford to keep their own air conditioning running around the clock during a stretch when electricity demand, and therefore electricity cost, spikes in tandem with the temperature. Utility companies across multiple states have quietly been asking customers to conserve power during peak afternoon hours, the same hours when the heat risk is at its most dangerous and residents are least able to safely reduce their air conditioning use. It is an uncomfortable irony sitting at the center of this entire emergency. The exact moment when people need cooling the most is the exact moment the grid is least able to reliably provide it, stretched thin by both demand and physical storm damage at once. The strain on infrastructure this week has not been limited to power lines and cooling centers. Grid operators across the affected regions have spent days managing a delicate balancing act, watching demand curves climb toward levels that, in some previous summers, would have been considered emergency territory rather than a Tuesday afternoon. Every additional degree of heat pushes more households and businesses to lean harder on air conditioning at precisely the same time, compressing demand into narrow afternoon and early evening windows that the grid was not originally engineered to absorb this consistently, this many days in a row. When storm damage then knocks out transmission lines or substations in the middle of that peak window, operators are left managing not just a repair job, but a redistribution problem, rerouting available power toward the most vulnerable customers first, while asking everyone else to conserve, all while temperatures outside make conservation feel less like a civic duty and more like a genuine risk to health. It is a system running close to its structural limits, tested simultaneously from two directions: heat driving demand upward, and storms tearing at the very infrastructure meant to deliver the supply. Beneath the numbers, the records, and the satellite imagery, there's a human layer to this story that rarely makes it into a 5-day forecast graphic. In Oklahoma City, breaking a temperature record that has stood for the majority of the city's recorded history is not just a trivia fact for the local news. It is agricultural workers finishing shifts under conditions the human body was never built to sustain for hours at a stretch. It is outdoor construction crews making the daily calculation of how much water is enough, how many breaks are too many before the job falls behind schedule, how close to heat exhaustion is close enough to call it a day. In Miami, a city whose relationship with heat is practically written into its identity, reaching triple digits for only the second time in recorded memory is a signal that something in the baseline has shifted, that the extremes this generation is living through are not simply hotter versions of what came before, but genuinely uncharted territory for a coastal metropolis that has weathered nearly a century of Florida summers without crossing that particular threshold. And in Arizona, the dust storm's aftermath has left behind more than fallen power poles and darkened traffic signals. It has left behind the quieter, harder to quantify toll of near misses. The drivers who managed to pull off the highway in time, the ones who did not, the emergency dispatchers, fielding a surge of calls in the space of a single evening as visibility collapsed across an entire metro area almost simultaneously. Local officials have been blunt in their public messaging this week, repeating the same core warning again and again. These storms can arrive with almost no notice, and the only reliable defense behind the wheel is to pull as far off the roadway as possible, turn off your lights, and wait it out rather than attempting to outdrive a wall of dust you cannot see through. Emergency dispatchers in the Phoenix metro reported fielding a dense cluster of calls within the space of a single hour as the storm rolled through, a pattern first responders have come to recognize as the signature of a fast-moving haboob event. Car accidents reported in tight geographic clusters along the same stretches of freeway, followed almost immediately by a second wave of calls reporting downed power lines and trees blocking roadways as the wind gusts that generated the dust wall continued tearing through neighborhoods even after the visibility began to clear. This is not the first time this particular stretch of desert has been hit this month, and forecasters have been careful to note that it likely will not be the last. Earlier in August, the same collision of thunderstorm outflow and drought-parched ground produced a separate, equally destructive event along the California-Arizona border, where storms reaching severe levels tore through Imperial County and La Paz County during the mid to late afternoon hours, generating damaging winds and flash flooding simultaneously. Peak wind gusts near 60 miles per hour were recorded at both the Imperial County Airport and the El Centro Naval Air Facility, and meteorologists monitoring the area noted that actual wind speeds may have run even higher closer to the storm cores in stretches of desert without instrumentation to measure them. The wind damage told its own story. More than 150 power poles compromised, according to the local irrigation district, with the heaviest destruction concentrated in the small communities of Holtville, El Centro, Heber, and Calexico, where more than 5,000 customers lost power at the height of the outage. A strong outflow boundary racing ahead of that storm cluster kicked up a dust storm of its own, a preview, in hindsight, of the far larger event that would strike the Phoenix metro roughly a week later. What makes this week's emergency distinct from an ordinary summer heat wave is the scale of overlap, not just in geography, but in timing. Forecasters have been watching a heat dome anchored over the southwest slowly migrate its influence eastward, even as the monsoon season continues delivering violent, fast-forming thunderstorm cells across the same desert region it originated from. It is, in effect, the atmosphere attacking on two fronts at once, and it arrives against the backdrop of a broader climate signal that scientists have flagged with growing concern, an El Niño pattern that forecasters say has continued strengthening toward record territory, with increased odds of reaching what meteorologists call super El Niño status by the end of the year. El Niño reshapes global weather patterns broadly, shifting storm tracks, altering rainfall distribution, and in many cases amplifying the very kind of prolonged, stagnant heat domes now gripping the American South. Whether this particular event will ultimately be remembered as a single dramatic week or as an early preview of an unusually volatile stretch still to come is a question forecasters are watching just as closely as the public is living through it. It is worth pausing on how differently these two disasters demand to be prepared for, because that difference is part of what makes this week so dangerous. A dust storm gives almost no warning. It can go from a clear desert horizon to zero visibility in under 2 minutes, which is why safety officials keep repeating the same instruction with almost mechanical insistence. If you see the wall of dust approaching while driving, do not try to outrun it. Do not try to push through it. Pull as far off the road as physically possible. Shift the vehicle into park. Turn off every light so that other drivers do not mistake you for a moving car, and simply wait. Heat, by contrast, offers no dramatic visual cue at all. There is no wall to see coming. It simply accumulates hour after hour, day after day, and its warning signs, a headache that will not fade, a wave of dizziness standing up too quickly, skin that has quietly stopped sweating, are precisely the kind of symptoms people are trained by ordinary life to shrug off. That is why public health officials keep circling back to the buddy system this week, urging people to check on elderly relatives and neighbors not once a day, but twice. Because the line between uncomfortably hot and a genuine medical emergency can be crossed with almost no visible transition at all. There is also the matter of what comes immediately next, because neither hazard shows clear signs of a clean exit. The southeast's heat wave, anchored by a stagnant weather pattern showing little indication of breaking down, is forecast to keep oppressive conditions locked in place through the weekend, with feels-like temperatures continuing to hover at or above triple digits across a wide stretch of the Gulf Coast and the Carolinas. Storm chances remain elevated across Arizona and the broader desert southwest as the monsoon pattern continues cycling through the region, meaning the same volatile mixture of dry ground, sudden thunderstorm outflow, and airborne dust remains primed to repeat itself with little advance warning. Meteorologists have been careful this week to frame the forecast not as a countdown to relief, but as a continuation, an emergency that has not peaked and receded so much as it has settled into place. One wave of heat and one round of storms handing off to the next, in an unbroken chain that shows no clean end date on the horizon. For the tens of millions of Americans living under these overlapping alerts, the emergency is not an abstraction unfolding somewhere else on a weather map. It is the decision to skip an outdoor errand until after sunset, only to discover the nighttime air offers barely any relief at all. It is the elderly neighbor being checked on twice a day instead of once. It is the sudden darkness of a dust storm swallowing a familiar drive home from work, transforming a 5-minute commute into a white-knuckled crawl along the shoulder of the road. It is a utility bill arriving weeks from now, quietly recording just how expensive it was to survive a summer that refused again and again to loosen its grip. There is a broader question sitting underneath all of this, one that meteorologists are careful not to answer with false certainty, but equally careful not to dismiss. Is this week an outlier, a particularly intense but ultimately isolated stretch of bad luck stacked on bad timing? Or is it a preview, a live demonstration of what an intensifying climate pattern, layered on top of a strengthening El Niño, actually looks like when it arrives on the ground rather than in a projection model? The honest answer offered by the scientists tracking it is that both possibilities remain on the table, and that the coming months, as El Niño continues building toward what could be record strength, will offer a clearer picture than this single week can provide on its own. What is not up for debate is the immediate reality facing the tens of millions of people currently living inside these overlapping alerts, a reality that does not pause for scientific nuance while a body overheats or a dust wall swallows a highway. What remains genuinely uncertain, the piece of this story that no forecast model can yet resolve, is whether this week represents the crest of the emergency or merely its opening chapter. The heat dome shows resilience. The monsoon pattern shows no sign of exhausting itself. And a strengthening El Niño sits in the background, quietly reshaping the odds for the month still ahead. 72.5 million people went to sleep this week under an active heat alert, while somewhere in the desert, another wall of dust was already gathering along the horizon, waiting for the next collapsing thunderstorm to send it rolling forward. Cooling centers will open their doors again tomorrow. Utility crews will keep climbing poles that storms only just finished knocking down. And somewhere between the scorched pavement of Charleston and the dust-choked highways outside Phoenix, a nation of tens of millions of people will wake up and do what they have done every day this week. Check the forecast, brace for whichever hazard arrives first, and hope that today is not the day the two finally collide at their worst, in the same place, at the same time. Whether the country gets a clean break before the next one arrives, or whether these two disasters continue trading blows across the map in the days ahead, is the question hanging over the entire nation right now. Unresolved, unpredictable, and for tens of millions of people, impossible to ignore.